Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after I wanted to provoke your OCD and omitted my usual introduction. Here we shall discuss the glass labyrinths of power, and as usual, well, as in most cases, you would have to wait a little bit until I would finally introduce the very concept. So, have you ever wondered why actions of political figures sometimes look absurd, like there's no internal logic or consistency to them? Like when they're like seemingly close to their goal, they sometimes turn around and go away from it or something, like almost by like neglecting their previous designs. Why do they sometimes demonstrate like contradictory behavior, why do they make inconsistent statements, let's say, like walk in circles or in spirals or something like that, metaphorically speaking? What's the matter with all that? And by the way, speaking about political figures, I really mean like any figures, because again, I usually use the word politics in a very broad sense. Again, my definition for politics is the decision-making in the situation of the conflict of interests, and literally any living being is in this situation. So any living being is political, any living being deals with power, etc., will to power, blah, blah, blah. You've probably heard this story from me many times already. But anyway, what's the matter? I shall use the political figures proper as just as an illustration for this pattern, right? But I'll return to this comment later, that it's really applicable much broader than we consider here immediately. So what's the matter with all this contradictory behavior? So I think that the problem is that observed landscape, let's say a landscape observed by the external observer, like faraway observer, like you and I, is different from the real geometry of power that these political actors perceive. So, for example, we don't have, well, I certainly don't have, maybe you have, access to various, special documents or other types of information signals that they might receive, the political figures, nor do we have access to their system of values. Like, we don't really know how they perceive the world. And it's very important in determining the behavior. The picture of the world determines the context. Again, system of values, what you consider good, what you consider bad, towards what you are going to and away from what you are going, so to speak. So it's all really important, and it's all inaccessible to us for the most part. And by the way, the reverse is also true. Like, we cannot really perceive again all their motivations and their perspective, but by the same token, the political actors, cannot perceive our perspective. So in some sense, they have a part of knowledge that we don't have, but at the same time, we have a part of knowledge that they don't have. So it's also worth keeping in mind, I would say. So the bottom line is that, yeah, we have different perspectives, we perceive the world differently. Like, roughly speaking, people in power versus a regular person, something like that. So finally coming to the title of this video. So my analogy here would be this glass labyrinth for this whole conundrum, let's say, where walls cannot be seen by an external faraway observer, and they sort of like, since they're made of glass, they kind of turn into a fog. If you observe from really far away, they're like this milky, foggy thing. And again, from far away, you might say, well, hey guy, you can just walk right there, you know, there's like a clear path right there. Like it's a bit foggy, but you can walk right there. But again, those external forces, you know, which I've metaphorically represented as these glass walls, they're still there. So the actor cannot move freely, you know, from point A to point B. They have to, you know, traverse this labyrinth to get to this whatever point B is. So this pathfinding becomes a problem in this case. And it's not obvious to the external observer that these forces are even there, you know. They don't impact you just because, well, you're not this guy, you know, who's in the labyrinth, in this sense. So, and another analogy you might draw here is the well, it's kind of sick analogy, but still, I think it's somewhat useful here. Is that this, you know, regular physics myth about the flat Euclidean space versus, you know, curved Hilbert-Einstein space, where basically in a flat space, which in this case, in my metaphor, is the space perceived by the external faraway observer, like the shortest path between 2 points is just a straight line. So you just shout to this guy, like, there's a straight line, you know, to your goal. You can just go there. Whereas in real life, so to speak, in his perspective, in his or hers frame of reference, so to speak, the space is sort of like curved. It represents this labyrinth. So the shortest path in this case is this curve, this wicked geodesic curve. So yeah, that's another analogy, I guess. So it all leads to a certain misunderstanding between, so to speak, us and them, you know. And, well, I guess a special case of such a misunderstanding would be a political analyst or an expert, you might say, who tries to derive a goal of a certain political actor by just extrapolating their motion, you know, into the future, let's say. So they perceive this guy in the labyrinth over there moving from point A to point B, and they just continue this line to somewhere, and then when it crosses something tangible, let's say, which is the point C, well, they imagine, I mean, those analysts, that point C was the goal of this actor, this guy in the labyrinth. Well, obviously this might not be the case. I mean, if the structure of the labyrinth, the arrangement of these power structures was complex enough, let's say, then this wouldn't be the case. I mean, they might just go to, I don't know, whatever, the nearest turn to the left or something. So this extrapolation is just invalid. So this is more or less a demonstration of why I came up with this analogy, right? Well, hopefully at least. So this extrapolation leads to failure. You cannot forecast, let's say, future decisions. Just, let's say, if you imply that they would move further through this line, right? Because, well, there's a complex power structure right there, this labyrinth of glass that they should traverse, and it's not even guaranteed that they were moving in this particular direction. Maybe they were only moving in this direction because they wanted to move in other direction, but there was no way of doing that because of all these walls, right? So they had to go there to turn, let's say, later. So yeah, these extrapolations are invalid in general case, at least. So the external observer does not understand goals and like the true direction of motion of a political actor, nor does an external observer has any information about the motives of the actor in the first place. Again, the context, the value system, the worldview, etc., etc. So, and even the situational, let's say, logic evades them. I mean, the external observers. So, well, like, I mean, situational in the sense, well, should I turn left or right at this particular crossing in the labyrinth, etc.? Because they don't even see the labyrinth, you know, the external observers. So this, all of that makes forecasting, political forecasting, basically impossible. And the picture of what's going on completely dissolves. We don't really understand what's going on there in this glass labyrinth. So in some sense it makes, you know, a throw of a coin a better forecaster than many of the political experts. But even all of that is only like half of the problem, or even I would say 1/3 of the problem. Other 1/3 of the problem, I would say, is the fact that labyrinth itself is not constant, even in this simple metaphor. Because all these powers that affect our political actor, they're not constant themselves. They interact with each other, rearrange, etc., etc. So in some sense, you might say that the labyrinth itself keeps rearranging, like the walls are constantly shifting, something like that, you know, like doors are opened and then they're closed, etc., and then blah blah blah. So the labyrinth itself is mutable. It's subject to change. And well, if we have an analogy of glass, you might say it kind of sometimes it melts in some of its parts and sort of like recrystallizes, even though glass is not really a crystal, it's like an amorphous crystal, but resolidifies, let's say, in another configuration, right? So the configuration of the labyrinth itself changes constantly. So that's another big complication, and yeah, pretty much that's it. And another third, I don't know. Well, another point, let's say, is that the actor himself or herself, this political actor, they actually influence the labyrinth also just by their presence and by their actions. So, and it's all dependent on their, let's say, political power compared to those other powers that, let's say, make up the labyrinth in the first place, in my metaphor. So we might think of, let's say, two limit cases here. One limit case, like there's like a continuous curve of a very complex character of how this influence occurs, but we might consider two limit cases. One limit case would be where the power of an actor is just overwhelmingly big, so it's much bigger than any of the powers involved in the construction of the labyrinth, so to speak. So in this case, yeah, you might say that they might just ignore the existence of labyrinth in the first place. They might just force their way through all this glass, so to speak. So just in a straight line, you know, and everything, all the other powers would subdue, you know, would submit to that act. That's one limit, let's say. But another limit would be an absolute powerlessness, let's say, of the actor, I mean, where they cannot influence the labyrinth in any way at all. So all the walls are like infinitely impenetrable and solid. So in this sense, in this situation, they just have to maneuver through in whatever way possible, or be just crushed by those walls, because, well, as they constantly shift, well, there's no guarantee that the passage you're going through right now wouldn't collapse, you know, And you might think of about this metaphor, this analogy, how some people are getting crushed, you know, by the power structures, are getting crushed by laws or whatever, and lose everything and commit suicide or something like that. I don't know. So that would be the thing I'm talking about. I mean, if they haven't maneuvered through this maze well enough, basically. That's my point. Okay, so in this sense, the goal, the purpose of the political analyst is to basically map this labyrinth, to help others to orient in it, right? So a political analyst should say, well, the situation is such and such. So they basically draw a map for us. Like the political powers are arranged in such a way that, let's say, here's a passage and here's a passage, etc., etc. So you can utilize this and that, blah, 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 to reach your goals in the current political situation. So we could make proper decisions and hopefully forecast their impact on our own lives, the lives of our relatives, etc., etc. So, okay. And in this sense, this mapping is a typical scientific task, you might say. And it's very similar to what is called in physics the inverse scattering problem, where basically what we want to do is to establish the distribution of masses or charges by like shooting stuff into the system, like whatever stuff. So we shoot stuff into the system is like a black box. We don't know what's inside, but we shoot stuff through it and we see how stuff behaves, how it bounces here and there. And from this accumulated statistics of bouncing off of stuff inside, we try to determine the shape and the composition of the stuff inside. So this is the kind of problem we're dealing with here. So imagine basically what object sits in this black box, right? So imagine a machine gun shooting into a barn, let's say, like etc. So it shoots into this barn where there is like an armored vehicle in the barn. So we shoot the machine gun and then we collect the bullets which have like glanced off or like whatever, and we try to determine the shape of this armored vehicle and possibly like other parameters like how strong an armor is here and there, etc. So it's a really classical physical problem, because like particle physics depends on it a lot, and even like higher scale physics, let's say, like for example, an electron microscope works on the same principle, like boom, scope, boom, scope, boom, electroscope, scope, boom. Yeah, well, I hope you appreciate like all the lengths I have to go through to avoid copyright strikes or something like that. Or I guess it all might be considered fair use by all the copyright owners. By the way, watch my video about copyright. Even though maybe they would perceive this as an unfair use, you know, like a desecration of the object of a copyright. Whatever. So in electron microscopes, what we're doing is we're shooting electrons into a small target, and like by the deflection, scattering, reflection of these electrons, we reconstruct the shape of the target, right? Something like that. And by the way, I spoke about barn, so it's actually a unit of measure of measurement in the like nuclear physics, because well, okay, it all goes back to the Manhattan Project, etc. So the physicists apparently needed some secret word to mean to be used as a unit of area, basically. So barn is a unit of area of a cross section. So almost literally what it means is like, how big of an area are we shooting at? You know, how big of an aim, what kind of area the aim has. So it has 1 barn or 2 barn or 3 barn or 4 barn, etc. And it's like a very minuscule area. It's like 10 to the minus 28 meters squared. So it's like 100 Fermi squared, basically. So yeah, it's literally like that. The logic is the same. Now I think the logic of the word barn, I mean, as used in nuclear physics, actually comes from the very same example or something like that. I don't know. Okay, so yeah, so it's basically an inverse scattering problem that we're dealing with. And in this case, in the case of our labyrinth of power, we have the very motion of political actors through the labyrinth serving as these bullets that we shoot, you know. So we use the motions that we observe as a probe of the structure of the labyrinth itself, in some sense. And again, by labyrinth, just in case, I remind you, I mean the arrangement of the power structures in the society, or any part of the society that we're currently considering. So, of course, it would be good for any analyst of this structure to like go there themselves, you know, to experience the labyrinth on their own, even in a posteriori format, let's say, interview people who went there, who've been there, or who are right there right now, right? To like, again, have at least some idea of what the labyrinth looks from the inside, like how were they moving, why did they turn to the left and not to the right, etc. So that's another instrument of getting information of about the internal structure of the labyrinth. Or they might participate in decision making in the first place. Let's say if an analyst is a part of some institution that needs an analytical information about the political situation. So they might be, in some sense, in the labyrinth also with this whole institution, right? Although, obviously, there is a danger in this sense, because an analyst with their own actions or their own motives or their own relations with other power structures, let's say, they might distort the structure of the labyrinth and therefore like do not probe it properly in some sense, right? And here we again arrive at this issue of non-linearity, I guess. Like, well, okay, I'll probably make a video about this, about what nonlinear phenomena are, etc. And in particular, I was thinking about focusing on time, like nonlinearities in time, such as, you know, prophecies or memory. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea for a next video. Not immediately next, but sometimes a couple of months later, as I usually say. So distortions are inevitable. Distortions in the way an analyst sees what's going on, right? Because they themselves might influence this. They themselves don't really have full knowledge of the motivations of the actors, etc., everything that we've discussed above. And yeah, because again, picture of the world really determines your reasoning. So if you are not aware of the picture of the world of whoever reasoning you were trying to evaluate, your evaluation would be false, most likely. And the best we can do, I guess, or those political analysts might do, is to minimize these distortions, and like in some sense not turn into a minotaur themselves, a minotaur who stalks this labyrinth and like kills everyone who appears there. Not turn into a black box yourself, you know, like don't involve yourself in the problem so that others wouldn't have to deconstruct not only the problem but yourself too from your evaluation, you know. It's not very healthy. But overall, you might say we arrive at this pessimistic and complex situation, and a question might arise, a quite a logical question, that is political analysis at all possible? Is it even possible in the first place? I mean, this question is justified, I would say, but at the same time, I would say that even considering all those distortions, still political analysis is useful because, well, an analyst, if he is somewhere far away from this power structure, they still might perceive, again, thanks to the distance, some larger structures, let's say in the labyrinth. They might notice some long-term patterns in the motion of these actors, right? So they might see these, let's say, a higher step hierarchy. Well, that's sort of a tautology, but well, larger structure, basically, that's my point. And in this sense, it allows them to, let's say, evaluate like strategic planning, I guess, something like that, because you might like juxtapose this with a tactical reasoning. You know, the analyst has this strategic vision, whereas a political actor has only tactical. Well, he constantly has to deal with tactical decisions, like should we turn left or right immediately? Like we should do something right now. You know, we don't have time to reprocess all of our trajectory and think about where we're going in the long run. We have to decide something right now and right here, right? All these forces are pressing upon us, all these political powers, and we have to maneuver. So we don't really have time to think about the long-term perspective, right? And by we here, in this case, I mean political actors. So they're kind of overwhelmed by this immediacy, like whether they should turn left or right now, or go straight, or maybe even go back. And perhaps an analogy for that might be, another analogy, because why not, might be driving a car versus like plotting a route on a map for a car. So both of these tasks obviously require focus, but driving a car requires like immediate focus. So it's best, you know, to have two persons, like one is driving and another is trying to plot the route, or something like that, because, well, the person who's driving, they don't really have time to do that, you know. They have to be focused on immediate, let's say, tactical decisions, like what are we doing right now? Like, I need this kind of information. Whereas the other guy who is plotting the route, they have some free time in some sense, right? So they have larger perspective. They don't have to be concerned with immediate action. So yeah, in this sense, political analysts are useful, because at least they're not overwhelmed by this immediacy. And so they might approach this whole issue scientifically, let's say, and making another light digression, hopefully light. I wish to say that the core of scientific approach is exactly that. It's building a roadmap, essentially. It's saying that this particular reason leads to this particular consequence. So, you know, what measures lead to what consequences? This is the task of science, again, to determine what I just said. So science is all about if-then type of structures, type of logic, if you like. Science doesn't tell you where you should go. It just tells you if you go there, you encounter this. And this is exactly what roadmap is, right? It says that if you turn right here, you will encounter this. And for example, you would have to turn left then if you move towards this goal. But a roadmap doesn't give you any goals. It doesn't tell you go from this town to this town, right? It's something that you determine on your own. But science is just a map. It just says that, well, to go from here to here, you should use this route or maybe this route, etc. But it doesn't have this motivation inside of it. It doesn't have the ethical structure inside of it. It doesn't tell you where you should go. Okay, sorry, that was a digression. Well, okay, so, and an interesting thing, you might say that that's another complication in our consideration in this metaphor in life in general, is that an analyst actually has a labyrinth of their own, you know. They're also subject to all kinds of political power. So they're not really far away, like they're far away from this guy in that part of the labyrinth, but they're still in the labyrinth of their own. And they're actually somewhat dependent on this guy, etc. So it all turns into this very complex, interconnected system in the end, right? But anyway, just considering the part of analyst as being in a labyrinth, we might say that, well, okay, I'll give you one example where it's really clear. Like, for example, we have so-called public analysts or experts or whatever. And they are situated somewhere between, let's say, science and journalism and propaganda. There's something in between all of that. So in this case, they're always connected to some political powers, you know. Either the powers they propagandize for, or the powers they're working for as analysts, as forecasters or whatever, etc., etc. So there are many possibilities. And in this sense, the analysts walk together with these political actors through this labyrinth, right? And you might even say that de facto, these public analysts are political actors themselves, right? Because, well, again, their opinion matters, right? So it means they have some political weight of their own. And so, yeah, so they have their own agendas, their own maps, let's say. So they have their own understanding of what the labyrinth looks like. It might be completely wrong, but they have it, right? That way or another, and at least some people listen to them. So overall, you might say that the whole labyrinth of political realm, again treating this word in a very broad sense, is let's say complex and large enough to include all those contradicting political powers and interests in a non-contradicting manner, let's say. So life is complex enough that two people might have opposite points of view and still coexist, you know, in this sense. And society is complex enough either, in the same sense. Okay, so just a couple of scattered points before we go to the conclusions. So one of the points I wanted to make here is that, and these points, by the way, are not present in my original essay, so it's like a bonus. An essay was written 3 years ago, if you're interested. You're probably not, and yeah, that's justified. So one of the things I wanted to add here is that this metaphor actually helps you to understand the origins of conspiracy theories, because, well, returning to what I've said previously about this extrapolation of the previous motion of a political actor as means to determine their goals. So it's exactly where conspiracy theories arise, because conspiracy theories imply some goal behind the observed action, right? So they say, well, these guys did that. Well, they did that for this specific purpose. So they imply this goal, like to hide that Kennedy was Hitler's brother or son, well, whatever, you know, something like that. So they killed somebody to hide this fact, or whatever. Like, hopefully you have enough imagination to come up with your own examples. But yeah, so the implication of goals, the complete ignorance about the labyrinth, about the complex game of power in society, is what drives conspiracy theories. They think that, well, if the guy moves there, it means that they wanted to move there. And they completely ignore that the guy, like, turned left, like, immediately afterwards. It doesn't concern anyone. Like, they moved there, it means that they aimed at something there, right? Something to that effect. Okay, and again, returning to my comment at the very beginning, that I think that it's actually applicable, this whole metaphor, this whole consideration, not only for the political actors, but also for everyone, basically, for any living being, almost literally. Because, well, again, as I've said many times, life is will to power, this Nietzschean idea, and life is just the dynamics of power ensembles and how they behave. So in politics, we just have a very clear and, like, direct, let's say, perception of the same process that really occurs everywhere, like in society, in science, in art, in philosophy, in mathematics, even in, like, physics, like, whatever. I don't even know what other examples to give you. Yeah, I think I've listed more or less everything. I mean, everything that there is in society, because all of that is also will to power and various aspects of it. All right, so another thing I wanted to note is that, well, I've talked a lot about the implication of motivation, of goals, etc. But, and again, at the same time, I've noted that it's really any actor to whom this metaphor is applicable. And, well, this actor might be yourself in this case, right? Like, your biography, as judged by others, well, they probably misunderstand it also. They don't understand your motivation, your goals, your, how do you say it, like, the conditions, that the environment you were in, which was a major factor in you making this decision or another, let's say. Let's put it that way. And I have an aphorism that I haven't yet posted to my Eugene the Philosopher Facebook page, just because it was written later. I only post there everything in chronological order. So this aphorism would appear there probably in a year from now or something like that. But we'll see. So it's something like, it is enough to at least once hear an evaluation of your own actions by other people to stop believing all the biographers and other contemporaries' accounts. So, yeah, the point is basically this, like, if you listen to how other people evaluate your actions, what kind of motivations they imply in your actions, like, a lot of times, especially when it's like any sort of major decision, right, they wouldn't understand why you did that. It's almost 100%. But okay, we can talk about psychology and how it all envelops in interpersonal relationships, but that would be a little bit too much for this video. So I'll just stop here in this particular comment. But I'll add a couple of others. Like, you might ask, or I would ask rather, that, okay, others don't really understand your motivation. That's a good point, and I think it's pretty clear. But do you yourself understand your motivation? That's another good question, I believe. It's like maybe you have an internal labyrinth in yourself, so to speak. And you also move in this external labyrinth as a whole, you know. And I think it's a reasonable suggestion because, well, really, and we're kind of going into very abstract terms, but really a human being is only, and probably any other being, is only a place of meeting of various political powers. And again, I'm treating the word political in a very broad sense, like your instincts, let's say, or what is usually called instincts. They might, one of them, let's say, might dominate you, but usually they kind of try to reach consensus, and this place where they try to reach consensus is you. It's the parliament, your consciousness. It's the place where your instincts try to cooperate in a civilized manner. But again, utilizing the same political analogy, they might rationalize their consensus in a completely ridiculous manner, like, which has nothing to do with reality, you know, like as you know, a government issues an act or a law that has a certain motivational part, whereas, you know, the real motivation is completely different, and perhaps it's not even, there's probably not even a single motivation. It's again, it's a result of consensus. So many different parties are interested in this law for their own reasons. And of course, this excludes many other different parties, but bad luck, let's say, no fate. So, yeah, so basically, the way a law is motivated formally has very little to do with its real motivation, plural, you know. And by the same token, the way you explain to yourself and to others verbally your own behavior is very different from, let's say, your real motivation, plural. But okay, that's another pretty difficult topic. But I think if you know anything about psychology, you would more or less see what I mean. Okay, so, and just a final remark here, like if you look at yourself, let's say 20 years ago, if you were even born back then, and like compare, well, okay, maybe 20 is too much, like 10 years ago, and like compare how you explained to yourself your own behavior back then and how you explain this previous behavior to yourself right now, I think you would already see a difference, right? So I think it speaks volumes already. But all right. So let us go to the conclusion, I guess. So in short, what I talked about in this video was this analogy that I have, a metaphor, which is supposedly might be used to understand the discrepancy in perceived actions of political actors versus, well, let's say, well, not the actions, well, motives. Like, let's say this metaphor might be used to solve the inconsistency between different perspectives, a perspective of a political actor and a perspective of an external observer, let's say. So, and the metaphor is the glass labyrinth. So political actor moves through the glass labyrinth, which the external observer is not aware of. So this is the whole point of this video. And as I've already said, this metaphor seems to be very general. So again, as I've already mentioned many times, I treat politics very broadly, because again, since everything is will to power and everything is manifests as power, then political power is only one particular case. But it's interesting because it's like in the spotlight, so everyone can relate to it in this sense, right? Okay, and while I was making this video, again, I was thinking about another analogy about for example, a spider web or something like that, because again, I keep talking about the networks, like the networks of power, how ensembles of power arrange themselves in networks. Like one node draws support from many smaller nodes, which draw support from even smaller nodes, etc. So that seems to be how ensembles of power organize themselves. So spider web would be a good metaphor for that, but I couldn't find a metaphor for how you would move through the spider web. Like, it doesn't seem to be metaphorically reorganizable into any decent narrative, let's say. Or maybe a system of tunnels, you know, like underground tunnels or something. But again, the whole external perception part would be missing. So I stopped on Labyrinth, the glass labyrinth of power. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.